Hello comrades, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about basically the development of the productive forces and what Marxism thinks about it, like the development of various economic systems and modes of production throughout history. So this is just going to be a brief overview. If you want more knowledge about this, then I would recommend that you check out at least Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Stalin. He goes over these, at least some of these, in that, and particularly what is it called, the origin of private property, the origin of family, private property, and the state by Engels, where he goes in great detail over pretty much all of these systems. And there's more. He goes like in very much detail, but basically this is going to be a brief overview, I hope, and I'm going to use Paint because I suck. I don't know. I don't have any better programs to demonstrate, but it doesn't really matter. It gets the point across, hopefully. First we have primitive communism there. So what is primitive communism? Primitive communism is basically hunter-gatherer society. There is no property. No property exists. There's not even really means of production at this point, unless I guess you would count various kinds of tools that people have made as means of production, but not really. There's not really any kind of means of production at this point. Therefore, there is no real property. Land isn't seen as property, and nothing like that. There's two stages of this. Actually, there is I don't know why I did that, but there's matriarchy. I think you type it like this, and then there's patriarchy. And the lines when one system transitions to another one, they're always kind of gradual, but it's still easier to think about them if you divide them up like this. Matriarchy and patriarchy, the difference between these is that in matriarchy it's the women who have like the economic and political power mainly. It's not like total domination, but they have most of the control. And this developed slightly differently in various kinds of tribes, but remember, this is basically tribal society, very small groups of people, few families constituting a tribe, and the women basically, they do the stuff at the actual camp of the tribe, and they also do the they gather, forage, collect various things from nature, as well as they do like primitive agriculture. And their economic importance in matriarchy, their economic importance was greater than that of the men who mostly did hunting. And that is why they had economic control. And this is one of the signs of this, I guess, the external signs of this was that not really property, but wealth and various kinds of things were material possessions. They were inherited in such a way that it was always the females who inherited their mothers. But when it switched to patriarchy, it basically became the opposite. That it was the men who now started to inherit the things, which is pretty much this patriarchal system continued afterwards. When agriculture developed sufficiently, and there are still various groups of people, various tribes that do primitive agriculture, which is like they're in like a jungle, and they I don't know what the term is in English, but they basically burn a bunch of the trees and the the plants, and then they plant their crops on top of that, and the crops basically use the nutrients that have been released from the stuff that was burnt. and it's very small scale and very primitive. And then they, when they've done that, they move along to a different place. And you know, that was even done in feudal times and even after feudalism in many places. But when that develops, and particularly when cattle raising develops, and this is when patriarchy sets in, they realize that, you know, this cattle is actually kind of like property. This is really when private property begins to emerge, and it is inherited. The cattle and the other stuff like that is inherited by the males. And previously in primitive communism there was no, I guess I should write that down, there's no means of production, really, no classes, and no surplus value, which pretty much equals no exploitation, because exploitation is pretty much impossible. Because in order for two people to eat, two people have to eat. I mean, two people have to work. That's what I meant. Two people need to work in order for both of them to eat. So it's not possible to have slavery, because the slave cannot produce enough for both him and his master. So exploitation is therefore impossible. But when productive forces develop further, you start to get slave society. So hold on. So you've got, like, you know what I just said, cattle raising, and you start to get classes. So there's like slaves and then free people, I guess. And surplus value becomes a thing, and private property becomes a thing. So it's not communism anymore. And previously, it's kind of interesting how all this works out, because according to Marxism, everything else is pretty much determined by the economic relations. So it's called the base and the superstructure. So the base is the economic relations, and the superstructure is the politics, the religion, the culture, and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting that in this primitive communism there's like cannibalism and stuff like that, which, and also the kind of they worshipped nature. And there was even these religious ideas that if you consume another guy's heart, you get his life essence or something. And that was, my guess is that would be because, you know, when they, in these tribal societies, when they captured various members of other tribes, there's no real good use for them. I mean, you can't put them to work. There's no real viable, you know. You can't really use slave labor at this point because it's not profitable. So what do? You eat them, and it developed this kind of a religious significance as well. Yeah, I guess I could write this down. So this is patriarchal. So slavery, and the most real, like, developed examples of this of slavery would be ancient Greece, ancient Rome, which were also like showing a lot of the signs of feudalism already, in my opinion at least, but they were predominantly slave societies, so there was a crazy ton of slaves. Then next we've got feudalism. So, and you can see there's like a development here. Means of production don't really even exist yet, so when means of production start to develop and private property becomes a reality, then surplus value becomes possible because of technical development, and therefore classes become possible. So classes emerge. You've got slave society. Then, and there was something else. Oh yeah. Land begins to be seen as property as well, and this causes like towns and like permanent settlements, I guess, permanent population centers begin to emerge, because it's not like primitive agriculture where you have to move constantly, and it's not primitive cattle raising where you got to move constantly. Because a good example of this is, just look at the North American indigenous people. They didn't think land was property. They never had even thought about that, because they didn't have developed agriculture. So with developed agriculture, land begins to be seen as property, and you get towns and stuff. Yeah, feudalism, you start to get towns. Contradiction between town and country, which is something that is rampant in capitalism. It's absolutely crazy in capitalism. And the classes in feudalism are pretty much the feudal aristocracy is mainly. So this is like the exploiter classes. There's feudal aristocracy, then there's like clergy, but they're basically the same. They're feudal landlords basically. And then you've got like merchants and bourgeois, I guess, to an extent, very small extent. You've got bourgeois. I mean, of course it depends like what stage of development, what stage of, if it's like early feudal or late feudal. But and then the exploited classes, you would have serfs, hired labor to a very small extent, and then mostly peasantry. So some places had serfdom more than others, and some places had it for longer periods of time than others. So serfdom is basically like a continuation of the slave society, because serfs were not slaves exactly, but they were kind of slaves. They were basically peasants who were tied to the land. So the feudal lord owns the land, and the serfs are part of the land, so that they can use the land, but they also have to do various kinds of work for the feudal lord, or they have to hand over part of their produce to the feudal lord. So the feudal lord is basically exploiting the hell out of them. But he cannot do whatever he wants with them, although many times they still kind of did, because come on, you're a feudal lord, you can do whatever the fuck you want. But basically, he couldn't technically sell them into like real slaves. But if he sold the land, then the serfs would be sold with the land, and the serfs would basically have a right to stay in their land, even though they didn't own it. And then there's, of course, the actual real peasants who own their small holdings and farm it. So the interesting thing is like the development from feudalism to capitalism. So now after feudalism we've got capitalism. So how does that happen? Well, there's like a growing contradiction between town and country. Let's see. Rural and urban. I guess that makes it more clear. So there's industry in the cities and there's agriculture in the countryside. Completely different situations happening. The bourgeoisie becomes, or the capitalist class, that becomes main exploiter class. So exploiters got the bourgeoisie mainly. I guess bourgeoisie, merchants, I guess, what should you call them, like rural capitalists, kulaks, and people like that. And the exploited classes are proletarians, so there's wage workers, semi-proletarians, which are basically like poor peasants, small owners who also work, and tenant farmers who don't even own their own land. They just rent the land and then they farm it, which was a really miserable existence. And Proletarians, semi-proletarians, yeah, that's pretty much it. And how this transition from feudalism to capitalism happens is that it mainly happens in the countryside. The interesting thing happens in the countryside because feudalism is pretty much 90% rural. There's like all the stuff happens in the rural areas, pretty much. Most people are small peasants. And what you can see in here is that here there's no property at all. No property here. So here it's like tiny property scattered because all the small peasants have a tiny piece. But here in capitalism it begins to centralize a lot. So that's, I guess, an important aspect as well. So centralization. And there's stratification of the peasantry. So what exactly is that? If you want to learn more about that, I suggest you read the early stuff by Lenin, the volume 1 of his collected works, and volume 3 as well. Is about the development of capitalism in Russia, so check those out. So basically what happens is the small peasants get poorer and the bigger peasants get more wealthy. There were various kinds of feudal systems in different countries. Like in Russia, there was this system in the village commune or in the village community that they would allocate the land between the families based on certain criteria, like and the wealthiest people would get most land, which eventually is going to make them even more wealthy. I mean, it's just a constant trend in the history of private property that the wealthier you are, the more wealthy you're going to get. So eventually the more well-to-do peasants start to rent land from the poor peasants, and this is made even more frequent by the fact that the small peasants, they don't have horses, they don't have the tools, so they can't even work most of the land, because it's just one family without proper tools or anything. So what do they do with the land? Well, of course they're just gonna rent it out to somebody else. So the rich peasants are gonna rent it and use it and get even more wealthy because they make a profit off the farming. And then the small peasants, they start to go bankrupt, because especially when commodity production develops. So I guess that's another huge deal, commodity production. So the sale of products are made for sale, because in feudalism, products in towns, yeah, they're made for sale, but it's very small. Most of the products, like the agricultural products, the peasants use for themselves, and the landlords, they just appropriate some of it. But there's no real massive trade going on. Basically, there's two systems going on. There's the feudal relation, where people make stuff for their own use and they don't really make much surplus. Then there's the system where the well-to-do peasants start to actually sell their products and make a lot of money and become more and more capitalistic. And the small peasants are eventually ruined. Increasingly they are ruined, and they go completely bankrupt, and they can't farm all their land, or if they have too little land, then they can't get much out of it. So they have to hire themselves out. They become hired laborers. And who's going to hire them? Well, of course, the exploiter peasants, because they have more land that they can farm themselves. They need extra labor. So there's stratification among the peasantry, and one part of the peasantry becomes rural capitalist, and one part of the peasantry becomes rural proletarians, so hired labor. And this happens, and this gives rise to capitalism. This makes capitalism possible, because there needs to be a huge amount of people who don't have any means of production. So there needs to be a ton of these landless peasants, because otherwise they would never go and become hired laborers. It's just necessary for capitalism to happen. If that doesn't happen, if these small peasants are never ruined, then capitalism never happens. Capitalism never becomes a reality. I guess there's then there's imperialism. So with imperialism, now this is like modern capitalism. You should all be able to understand what that is. So now the entire world has been divided. So there's colonies. And super exploitation of and imperialist war. So the entire world has been divided, and capitalism is no longer only national; it becomes international. There's a whole host of colonies, neo-colonies, independent countries, which the exploiter nations, the exploiter countries, the imperialist capitalist countries exploit. So now there's only property has centralized so much that now it's not only some capitalists own stuff. It's like there's entire nations which have these like gigantic corporations, absolutely massive corporations, which now are in some cases bigger than small countries in terms of wealth. And these imperialist exploiter countries, which serve their own corporations, they go out and they exploit other nations, their cheap labor, their natural resources, and perhaps most importantly, they want to take over these new markets of these other countries. And this causes imperialist war because there's inter-imperialist rivalry. For example, First World War was a perfect example of this, and the Second World War as well. It was a war about the redivision of the world, and the First World War especially was a war about the redivision of the colonies. And these more recent imperialist wars, for example, the United States attacking pretty much every other country on the planet, like every country in Central and Latin America, Middle East, and so forth. Those have been just traditional, the same thing that Britain did, and Portugal, and Spain, and France. So it's like colonialism, except it's modern, so it's neo-colonialism. Exploiter nation attacking other countries to exploit them better. If there's a government that wants to improve their conditions and doesn't want to bow down to US corporate interests, then the United States is going to try to overthrow them, either by coup d'etat or economic sanctions or funding terrorist groups like the Free Syrian Army or something, or the Taliban or Mujahideen or something. Or it's going to be just outright invasion, which is what usually happens if all else fails. The Mujahideen pretty much, or the Taliban, was pretty much enough to topple the pro-Soviet Afghan government. But the Free Syrian Army wasn't enough to topple Assad, so the United States tried to invade, but it failed. The economic sanctions against Iraq failed, and any kind of internal revolution failed, so the United States eventually invaded Iraq. Yeah, but that's that. Now, what's going to happen after imperialism? I guess we could call this like post-imperialism, super-imperialism. So, the only thing that I can really think of that's going to happen is that there's going to be like these multinational corporations bigger than countries. So that's pretty much the only thing that's like seems rather obvious that this is going to be happening, that these corporations are going to get so big that they're going to be the entire Western world is going to be like one corporation exploiting all the other countries on the globe or something. But yeah, that was kind of my overview of all the various economic things. And yeah, I will see you guys next time in another video. Bye bye.